then please do take off your camera. If you have questions, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end, then just drop them into the chat box and we'll be coming to those later. So please do add your questions in as the speakers are making their input, and we will come back to those. So I'd like to introduce the event and welcome the speakers. Now, at the start of 2020, and it feels like a long time ago now, employment had reached a record high. But since then, the coronavirus crisis has triggered an unprecedented economic crisis. And despite government measures to protect jobs, we are experiencing the sharpest rise in unemployment that we have on record. Yesterday's labour market stats gave us an insight into the scale and nature of the challenge that we face. And during today's webinar, we will be exploring some of those statistics and discussing where we go from here. We're delighted to have you all participate, a really large and varied audience. And I'm also pleased to welcome an impressive lineup of contributors. We'll start with Stephen Evans, who's Chief Executive of Learning and Work Institute, looking at what the data tells us about the employment crisis. We'll then move on to Seema Malhotra MP, who is Shadow Employment Minister, to think about where we go from here, and then have a provider perspective from Elizabeth Taylor, who's Chief Executive of ERSA. Again, we'll have questions after that where I'll ask each of the panellists to respond to you, so please do drop those questions in. Now, if we can go to that first question that we asked you when you enrolled. Can we put the slide up, please, Mintra? So we asked you about the extent of the challenge that we face. We asked you whether the increased employment you think will be temporary and we'll see unemployment fall significantly as lockdown eases, or whether you think that it's likely to be long lasting and that we need action to help Britain get back to work, or a third option that we don't know. So can we see the results of the poll, please, Mintra? Do we have those slides? Great, thank you. Some overwhelming opinion from the audience that the increase in unemployment we have seen is likely to be long lasting, and we need some intervention to help Britain get back to work. So for each of the contributors, then we'd be really looking forward to seeing what sort of interventions we think we need. Now, you've said that we need some interventions. The purpose of this event is to discuss what they are. And what I'd like you to do, again, is to jump back onto Slido and ask you a second question. And the second question is about what the most important things that you think the government should do to tackle unemployment after coronavirus. Now, it may be that you think all of those. What I'd like you to do is to pick up to 3 that you think the government should focus on in its package of measures. So the options we have are boosting public investment to create job opportunities, cutting employer national insurance to encourage employers to recruit, introducing a youth guarantee to prevent youth unemployment, investing in employment support to help people back to work, investing in retraining for workers who have lost their jobs, provide employment and skills support to furloughed workers at risk of redundancy, extending the coronavirus job retention scheme beyond October, and relaxing the social distancing rules from 2 to 1 metres to allow more businesses to operate. So could you identify up to 3? And later on, when we've had the inputs, we'll come back to those findings. Right, first of all, I'd like to ask Stephen Evans now to give us an input and to talk to us about what the data published yesterday on the labour market tells us. Stephen, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Fiona. So I can see from that first poll that you're all in the "we're all doomed" rather than "don't panic" category. And I suspect that may probably increase further when I show you this set of charts. What I want to do is just talk a little bit about what we know so far about the impact of the virus on the labour market, what the new data yesterday tells us, and then start to lead us into that discussion that Fiona mentioned about what we can do about all of this. So if we go across to the next slide, this chart shows employment, unemployment, and economic inactivity rates over time going back to 1971. And if you look at this, you'd be sort of perhaps thinking, well, this all looks fine. Virus, what virus? Because this all looks as though the data's swimming across here. If you get your magnifying glass, you can see some slight dips towards the, if we can just go back to the previous slide, please. You can see some, you see a spoiler alert there. You can see some slight dips towards the end in these lines going in the wrong direction, but actually things look pretty strong. However, that most of this data is from a long ago era known as February, and most of the data is pre-lockdown. So even the March data, most of that is before the lockdown. And so you're only in this data really starting to see a little bit of the impact of lockdown and the other related measures. So to see what's really happening now, we have to look at more timely measures. So if we look at the next slide, this shows the claimant count. So this is the number of people claiming unemployment benefits. Now, this is not a perfect measure because you can be out of work and not claiming benefits. And some of the people in this measure will be working a small number of hours because you're allowed a certain number of earnings before you come off the claimant count. And we don't quite have the data to tell us exactly how many that is. But it's a good indicator, it's a good proxy, and it's meant to be consistent over time. And it should be fairly obvious from the data here, this massive spike up that we see during April and May. So what we have data here is data up to May. And in fact, the increase that we've seen in May is the largest annual increase in the claimant count since records began in 1922. So this is a huge scale of increase that we haven't seen before. 2.8 million people now on the claimant count. That's back to levels last seen in the early 1990s. I've just seen a question come through about only being able to see up to the end of 2018. This data does go up to May. It's just the axis there doesn't include the all of the dates. So I promise you that that goes up to May 2022. It's just the axis that doesn't just mentions each December, which is why you can kind of see December 28 as the last one mentioned. So the largest increase in claimants' unemployment on records going back to 1922. Then if we go on to the next slide, this shows what's been happening to employment. So that was unemployment on the claimant count measure. This is employment. And we have, from the ONS, we have single month measures. So on the first chart, I showed you February to April. Here, I've got some data for April, and you can see that little dip down there. We also have more timely data for May from the HMRC. Now, this only includes employees, so it's not a perfect measure. Doesn't include the self-employed, for example. That's why that orange line is always below the blue line, because it's not counting all employment. But I include it here because we've got more up-to-date data through it. So it gives us an indication. And what it says is that during April and May, about 600,000 people, employment fell by 600,000 over that time period, which is the biggest increase we've seen on that HMRC data going back to 2013. So we are seeing those sharp drops in employment and rises in unemployment. Actually, the rise in unemployment could well have been larger, but we had the coronavirus job retention scheme, which more than 8 million people have been furloughed under. And also we have things like the self-employment income support scheme. And there is some suggestion, it's quite difficult to tell, but there's some suggestion in the data that some self-employed people who've got support through that may be showing up in this data as economically inactive, i.e. they've paused, they're not looking for another job, they're waiting for their business conditions to return. So we've got a big fall in employment, could have been a lot bigger, and we've got a big rise in unemployment as well. So none of these are perfect measures because the ONS measures are the better ones, but they're always a couple of months behind. So if we want to know what's going on now, we have to look at these more timely data, and they give us a pretty clear indication that employment has dropped significantly in ways that we haven't seen, and unemployment has risen significantly in ways that we haven't seen. So these are really sharp shifts. And if you look at the universal credit data as well, which we haven't got on these slides, I think the number of universal credit claims spiked up after lockdown was announced at the end of March, 23rd of March, to about 7 times their pre-crisis levels. And since then they've dropped back, but they're still running about 20–25% above pre-crisis levels. So we've got that massive spike in universal credit claims, and then we've got a reduction, but still above pre-crisis levels. So that gives you a sense about the timeline of some of the changes. If you then go on to the next slide, all of this translates through into fewer hours being worked. So this data goes back to 1971, and it runs up to March 2020. Again, you can't see this on the axis, on the x-axis, because it just mentions February, but the latest data is it's February to April 2020, which is why it doesn't show up yet. And what we can see is that even in that early period of the crisis, we've got this sharp dip down on the right-hand side, 80 million fewer hours worked than a couple of months before. Now, this is a combination of more people being unemployed and employment dropping, so there's fewer people in work, but also those who are in work working fewer hours, either because they're furloughed or because their hours have been reduced down as well. So it all comes together into that hours worked data, which is a little bit further behind the claimant count data, but gives an indication. So I expect next month this line to go even more sharply in a downward direction as we get more up-to-date data. Basically, every graph I've got, these are the graphs of doom really, and they all involve lines going sharply in the wrong direction. But we will come to the optimistic bit about what we can do about it. However, before that, we've got another graph coming up where the line goes sharply in the wrong direction. On the next slide, please. So this is the number of vacancies on the ONS measures. This is the stock of vacancies. It's not new vacancies notified. It's the total number of vacancies that the ONS is measuring. And you can see again this really sharp drop, vacancies in the economy down from about 800,000 to about 300,000 today, or sorry, in April 2020. So that's a drop of about 60%, far sharper drop than we saw in 2008 in the last recession. And I haven't got the slides here, but if you dig down underneath this, you can see probably what you'd expect to see, which is an effective almost shutdown of recruitment in places like retail and hospitality. Although still some recruitment going on because you get natural labour turnover, and actually there were some growth areas within retail and hospitality as people switch to deliveries, for example, but a smaller drop-off in things like health and social care. Excuse me. So you've got that really big reduction in vacancies. There are some surveys of vacancy websites, so people like Adzuna and other vacancy websites, which suggest that the decline in the number of vacancies has bottomed out somewhat during May and June, and may even show some signs of starting to recover a little bit, but still way down on where we were. So we're some way off a sharp V-shaped recovery in vacancies. So with unemployment rising so sharply and vacancies dropping so sharply, the figure on the next chart shouldn't be a huge surprise, which is that we have more people chasing fewer jobs. So this is an estimate of the number of unemployed people measured by the claimant counts per vacancy as measured by the ONS. And you can see that before the last recession, there was roughly about 2 unemployed people for every vacancy, a bit less overall. And then it then goes up to almost 4 unemployed people per vacancy once you get into the aftermath of the financial crisis. And then we go back down, and pre-crisis, we were looking at about 1.7 unemployed people per vacancy. And then when you get to April and May, you see that increase just skyrocketing up. So we would estimate that there's almost 9 unemployed people for every vacancy at the moment, because unemployment's gone up sharply, vacancies have gone down sharply. And that is just unheard of in this period that goes back almost to the start of the millennium. So a really tough jobs market, it goes without saying. So if we then move on to the next slide, what I've given you so far are some headline numbers about how high unemployment has gone overall and how much employment's gone down, and again what's happened to vacancies. But actually, as well as that really stark overall impact, we've also got a differential impact. So some groups and areas seem to be being hardest hit or harder hit than others. So we picked out one group here, which is young people, and youth claimant unemployment has more than doubled in the last 2 months. Now, in lots of recessions, in fact, most recessions, young people tend to get hardest hit. Their employment does also tend to recover more quickly when the economy recovers. But we know that a period out of work when young has long-lasting impacts on people's pay and job prospects. So this is a really worrying sign, and you can see that claimant unemployment for young people, which is, I shall respond seamlessly almost to the question that's popped up, is 18 to 24-year-olds. That's now up to levels that we saw in the peak after the last recession, though behind what we saw after the early 90s recession. So a really sharp spike in unemployment for young people, claimant unemployment for young people, and that's really worrisome given that the impacts that has. And then if we go on to the next slide, this looks at things geographically. So there's basically loads and loads of bars here, so you don't need to sort of read every single one, be able to see every single one. What it's doing is looking at how much the claimant count has increased, by how many percentage points has it increased between March and May. And then it ranks it from the areas that had the lowest unemployment to start with on the left-hand side to the areas that had the highest unemployment to start with on the right-hand side. And you can see, of course, there are exceptions, but in general, the places on the left that had the lowest unemployment to start with have seen the smallest rises. And the places on the right that had the highest unemployment to start with have seen the largest rises. So we don't know if this will continue on, and we don't know what will happen as the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, starts to unwind. But so far, there are early indications that claimant unemployment is rising fastest in parts of the country that had the highest unemployment to start with. And that feels to me like splitting apart as opposed to the government's aim of levelling up. Levelling up was a pretty tough goal to start with. It feels like it risks getting harder as a result of this impact as well. So then if we move on to the next slide, basically, I guess my summary is it's very clear that the labour market has got very bad very quickly, with large increases of the like we haven't seen before in unemployment and drops in employment, and a differential impact on different groups and areas of the country. And of course, we've got lots of uncertainty ahead. So as I mentioned, we've got the 8 million furloughed workers, and what will happen as that scheme starts to get withdrawn over the summer and going into October. Some of workers there are bound to lose their jobs, so that's going to add to the tally. And what's happened in previous recessions is that it usually takes years for the labour market to recover, even if the economy bounces back quickly. So I haven't shown the chart here because I didn't want to overwhelm you with too many charts. But if you look at, it took 3 years for employment to recover after the last recession. But after the recessions of the 80s and 90s, it took 5 and 7 years for employment to recover back to where it was. So even if the economy starts to grow back, and we don't know whether it will or not, it feels like it's going to take years for the labour market to recover. And in particular, all recessions are different. This one's peculiar in the sense that we've deliberately caused it by introducing the lockdown for good public health reasons, and therefore it's not quite clear as we release some of those lockdown measures at different speeds across the UK what the impact will be. Also, we have the ongoing social distancing restrictions, so that will reduce the capacity of retail and hospitality, for example, and they tend to be very job rich sectors as well. So all of these say to me, coupled with the EU transition to a new trading relationship with the EU from January, whatever that looks like, that says we've got enormous uncertainty ahead, and that's why we argued for a plan for jobs. And just to very quickly say the three elements of that are set out here. So the first is that we need to act to create jobs for all the reasons that I just mentioned. It's quite possible employment won't bounce back quite as strongly as we might hope. So we called for public investment, but that needs to be in really shovel-ready, job-rich schemes. So infrastructure is great, like railways and stuff. That's great. It's really important, but it's not going to create lots of jobs quickly. So how do we do that? How do we? We also argued for hiring incentives for employers to take on unemployed people. Young people, I mentioned the scarring effects on their career prospects. So we argued for a youth guarantee of a job training scheme or apprenticeship. And then employment support. You know, we've got those people who lost their jobs just after lockdown will now, if they haven't found new work, they've been out of work for about almost 3 months. So as well as ramping up Job Centre Plus, and we argued for at least another 10,000 work coaches, doubling the current number, we think we need to get expert employment support and recruitment agency support in for that group, and to intervene for those who are furloughed and put at risk of redundancy, as well as I think someone mentioned on the comments there, making sure that we don't forget about those who were out of work before the crisis. And we argued for better support for them, including a jobs guarantee, building on the Future Jobs Fund that was introduced after the last recession. So I could go on about this for at least another hour, and the good news is I'm not going to, but hopefully that gives you a sense about where we're seeing the data and some of the challenges and risks ahead, that this isn't going to be a short lasting thing. It will take time to recover, and therefore we need an ambitious and speedy plan for jobs.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really helpful, and thank you for everyone who's putting questions on the chat. We'll come to some of those later. Before we do that, I'd like to hand over to Seema Malhotra, who's the Shadow Employment Minister. And Seema, we're particularly interested in your reflections on those labour market statistics and what you think the employment response from government should be. Can I hand over to you, please?
That's great. Look, thank you very much, and thank you to Stephen, to you, and to Joe and all at the LWI for what you're doing and putting this session together. I'm also conscious there are some really important comments in the chat, and hopefully there'll be a chance to come back on more of them. But I do think they're all extremely well made, and hopefully we'll be able to capture those and also feed those into our thinking in Parliament. My reflections are this, and I think clearly the crisis has sparked this unprecedented rise in unemployment. With and the story that Stephen has outlined is a really important one, showing the scale of that, comparing it not just using one statistic, which is the claimant count, but also looking at the problem from other points of view, with the drop in those in work on HMRC data, the number of 18 million fewer hours being worked, but also that growing jobs gap between the number of jobs available and the number of people who will be seeking work. I think that's a really important area to keep an eye on, because in how we think about responding, there are kind of some key aspects that I'll come on to. You know, the first being around the plan to save the jobs where we can, and the second being around creating the jobs that we need. And so a plan really that's looking at both of those, and then the access to jobs both through employment support and what what analysis may lean us towards as well around guarantees, and some very good ideas coming out from the Learning and Work Institute and others is important for us to draw on. And part of the analysis that we've been doing is what the impact has been of programs over the last 40 years, because what we're seeing may also need to take learnings as well as from the very efficient Future Jobs Fund that is often drawn on because of the evaluations that were done in 2012 showing the impact in increased tax take and sustained employment and the value for money that the public sector got from those jobs that were created. But also there have been other programs, because whilst the data is showing the disproportionate impact so far on younger people, with I think under 30s in sort of the data certainly prior to yesterday accounting for around a third of those on the claimant count. We don't know what's going to happen post furlough, and we don't know what that's going to mean in terms of other different age bands being impacted in different ways. And I know what, certainly what Labour did in 1997, having sort of New Deal for young people as well as a New Deal that was for over 25s, also was important to look at and learn from. I also do want to mention, or just draw a little bit more of what Stephen was saying around the differential impact, because looking at this, it is showing quite an unequal unemployment impact. As well as the young people, we're seeing that a quarter of temporary workers reporting they're now definitely or probably unemployed because of the pandemic. That's compared with 4% of permanent salaried employees. For the self-employed, that Stephen also touched on, many of whom work in the gig economy, 75% have reported that they've earned less than usual, compared with 26% of permanent salaried employees. And the impact has also been greater on BAME people, because there is some research that shows that 46% of BAME people reported that their household impact has been reduced as a result of coronavirus, compared to around 28% of white British households. And part of that is because we know that many of those in different minority communities are employed in more precarious work, lower paid, and often at front line. So they're not necessarily the same sort of office-based roles that have been able to be more smoothly sustained in this period. So I think we have to have a mind towards what the unequal impact has been, and as part of the plan that we have emerging, how we're going to deal with some of that disproportionate impact in different sectors and geographies and demographics. The geographical impact, I think, was very well illustrated by the LWI analysis, and also when you start to look at some of the data around who's impacted and where. Even prior to yesterday's figures, you had youth unemployment approaching 10% in the northeast, and so there are variations in how different demographics are being hit in different sectors, which I think lends itself to thinking about how the government is going to need a national framework, as well as being able to respond, have local responsiveness and flexibility, and ensure that the interventions and the access to resources are building on some of those important principles, because those on the ground are going to be a very big part of how we reach those who are unemployed and do that efficiently and effectively. And I think there's a lot to be learned from how local authorities and local partnerships have been involved in developing resilience through the health crisis, but how we're going to need to think about local resilience and local partnerships being a big part of the answer for tackling the employment crisis that we're looking at the moment. I just want to reflect very briefly on what the government has done right as well, because there are some important things that have happened successfully. The job retention scheme was the right thing to do. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think of the numbers. We've seen 1.1 million employers apply to furlough employees, and around 9 billion as well. 9 million employments that's been furloughed. But it didn't cover many new starters, freelancers, workers on short-term contracts, and there was a Treasury Select Committee report that came out this week that highlighted some of those gaps and has sought to press, as indeed the position have the government to extend some of the eligibility criteria, and they've done this in incrementally through, but it's clear that that need continues. There's also been some concerns still ongoing about not requiring eligible firms who are eligible to furlough their staff, and certainly we've had casework. I've had casework as well that has where employers have got the choice and have chosen to not furlough staff. And we've had some successes where we've really laid out what that it is possible to do, and it is their choice, and they are eligible, and that has helped. But how many people go to their MPs, and their MPs are then raising it with individual employers? I mean, that's just some of the the scale of casework that we've had and battles that we've had to fight. But also, there were other things that could have been learned from, and I think, may need to be thought about in going forward around reduced working hours, working with unions and others on how you might do that, particularly to be looking at how you can support people staying in employment, even if the sector that they're in may have a longer tail of recovery. But having people leave employment, be unemployed, and then industry picking up in a year, or some areas maybe 2 years. The projections are different for different sectors, but they're going to need to recruit again. So what can we do to look at how we can support where we can? On those aspects. A couple of points are just on the chat that I do want to draw on before I sort of outline some thoughts in response to where I think we can go and what needs to be part of the plan. There are comments made around lone parents and people with disabilities. I think those are really important to draw out as well, because and I have made mention of this before, because they're also disproportionately affected in the statistics. And when we think about this whole conversation, I think we've got to be thinking about income as much as we do about jobs, because people have maybe in work still, but they've been losing income. And for many as well, even being on 80% of their salaries is the difference between being able to pay the bills at the end of the month or not. So we're also facing a huge financial inclusion challenge. So if I can just make a few suggestions, and then I'm sure we'll pick this up on the in the conversation about what do we need to do to help get Britain back to work. If I can just outline a couple of principles before that, because inclusion and resilience have got to be really important lessons for how we come out of, how we should design ourselves a process that and how we come out of this crisis. Because if anything has become more apparent, it has been a lack of resilience that we've seen both in our institutions, whether that's the Health and Safety Executive, that's seen systematic cuts over the last 10 years, local authorities and the income challenges they're facing. There was a debate about this at Just Questions today about the 10 billion the local authorities are talking about needing to plug the gap between lost income and increased spending and lost income, and only 3 billion so far pledged. Now, local authorities are going to have to play a role in this, because we're also going to have reduced travel and all of the impacts of COVID over the next period until the health crisis is over. So we need to think differently as well about how we're ensuring safe workplaces and the resources to be able to work at home as needed, because lockdown in different ways and cycles could be a part of our lives for some time to come. So the first thing we have to do is really recognise the scale of this, and this is where I think some of my conversations with government as well have been quite instructive. Where where obviously I think the government they'll be looking to scale up structures that exist now. They may not be enough, whether that's the Work and Health programme or some of the other programmes. They may or may not be as fit for purpose. It's discussions I've had with providers as well in different parts of the country. So making sure that we have structures that are fit for purpose and fit for scale is going to be increasingly important, and also that the support is provided, because one of the things that was a challenge up until certainly a few years ago was that the schemes were very transactional, and they didn't really have the same sense of relationship around that person, providing support needed, and as people went through transition into unemployment and then support to get back in to work. And what I think would be really kind of problematic is if we just end up with millions of people being served by a system that doesn't have the resources or the plans to deal with this, and in all parts of the country as well. You know, from coastal areas that have been very hit by the hospitality and other sectors. We've got aviation communities as well. My local area is looking at 40% of households affected by the hit to aviation. There are lessons that we've got to learn as well if that is sustained from areas like mining communities that saw a massive local dependence on one area of employment. So what do we need to do to look at resilience and balancing of our economy? Where are the weaker points going in, and how are we going to try and invest in the areas to tackle some of that coming out? So I think we need to really focus, as I think mentioned before, on three key things. First is job retention and an exchange that might be the sort of saving of jobs where we can now, and the work to go into that. The second is a post-war scale of ambition in job creation, and that is going to be a lot in sort of the green environmental sector. But looking at investment, I think the ideas of bringing forward schemes that are already in train, but also where do we need to think differently about the economy that we need to create and what our needs are as a society for the future. And thirdly, the reformed and reimagined employment support, being able to work with what's going well, but also to say, look, that's not necessarily going to be sufficient. Partnerships and investment for those partnerships are going to be essential, working with employers, making sure that there's a plan for jobs that can be localised with where there's an opportunity to extend jobs and support them, but also a plan for skilling and reskilling. What I think we've got to be very careful of is that we don't see downskilling as a consequence of people being out of work, as well as the upskilling and reskilling that we need. So just to close, I think one of the important contributions that we've also made this week is the call for a back to work budget. The reason why that's important is because the fiscal measures that might be needed to incentivise growth in different sectors, to support employers as well. The way we need to have a budget to support the needs for local authorities to be developing plans and resource those plans and working with the local employment partnerships. We're going to see a sort of critical stage in terms of investing early and investing with evidence on where this needs to come, and a budget this summer prior to going into the autumn so that we start to plan early is going to be really important for the stimulus that we're going to need, and so that we don't see ourselves stumbling through the employment crisis as we have in the last stages of the health crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seema. That was really helpful, and lots there to stimulate discussion. I'm aware that there's lots of questions already, so keep those coming. First of all, I'd just like to ask Elizabeth Taylor, just for a couple of 2 minutes, just on what you think the role of employment-related providers can play, and then I'll bring you back in for the questions. Elizabeth.
Hi. Well, first of all, I think the really important thing to say is that we've got to be aware of the diversity of the employment support sector and not to make assumptions about what their offer is going to be now. Also, for many of us in the sector, this is the fourth recession. We're the old guys, but we've been through these before. So we have the history and the expertise within the sector. From ERSA, we've been doing some sector-based surveys about resilience and readiness. And the things that we've learned from those is that the provider community are ready. They're ready to respond. We've been waiting now probably for 3 months. But bearing in mind that the sector isn't what it was. And I think there's an element of, in the coming weeks and months as we move forward, it needs valuing and reassuring that as it plays its part in getting Britain back to work, it's going to be recognised. I think it's really important to talk about the diversity of the sector and not just to assume that it's the big providers who are running some of the big national DWP contracts. We've got local authorities, we have the whole third sector, particularly those involved with building better opportunities. So as we look at the options, and the options right before us now seem to be about expanding some of the existing provision, That existing provision was not procured for the impact of COVID-19, but there are really good organisations with excellent employment support staff who can get people into work who are very close and ready to the labour market that have dropped out of work now. But I think we've got to look at other immediate solutions, and we have to plan for the future. From ERSA, we are totally in support of the plan for jobs. We would love to see a budget for jobs. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is that people aren't going to return to the work they had before. People who've been in work for a long time don't have job search skills, don't even have a CV. All those things that people used to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, that how much time the providers spend doing CVs. So I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to. So it's about how we get people into work. And then without a huge job creation scheme, we're going to be in a situation where we need to keep people close to the labour market. And I think that that is a part that the employment support community can play. We've delivered those provisions before, New Deal. Gosh, some of us remember Manpower Services and things like Future Jobs Fund. So I think that whole thing about keeping people really close, that's what we will need. It's what we'll need, particularly around youth, because that's going to take time and we don't want to lose this generation. But as we create jobs, the sector can train people for those jobs. I know I was asked to keep it really short, so my final point would be, I would like to see a collaborative approach to this, not a competition between the job centres and the outsourced provision. That will not be healthy as we get Britain back to work. And we need to see a mixture of national provision, local provision, sector-based responses, and the whole thing around specific claimant groups, whether it's women, BAME, youth, that we can play in alongside that national, local, sectorial. And just to remember, at the end of the day, we need really, really strong employer relationships. And I have one final point I want to say, and this is my final, I'm looking at you, Fiona. We mustn't stop the agendas that we were working on. The whole thing around health and disability and work and the most disadvantaged and engaging with the partners of claimants. There's a whole piece of work that is as relevant as it ever was. And actually, the experience of some of those provisions will be very relevant for people who've been ill during COVID-19, because those provisions are geared up for that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and that was a great input. We've got questions coming in, which we'll come to, but we also have the poll. So, Minja, could we see the results of the poll that we've had, where our participants have said what they think should be the focus? So these are the questions, and do we have the responses? So here are your responses. I'm going to be asking the panelists to reflect on those at a moment, with a priority around public investment to create jobs opportunities, so that we're creating opportunities as well as supporting people to go into them, but linked with employment support to help people back to work. A focus on a youth guarantee, thinking about the scarring effects of youth unemployment, but as was reflected in the comments, that we also think about older workers who have lost their jobs and those who are furloughed. So some really interesting results there. Thank you for everybody who has participated. And I've been watching the chat as well, and panelists have quite a few really interesting questions that I'd like to come to. Lots of support for particularly helping young people, but we do need a balanced response where we're thinking about adults in the workforce and not young people. And also a concern that we not just address the needs of those who are just coming out of the labour market, but those furthest away, perhaps have been out the longest and perhaps marginalised more anyway, particularly those who are disabled, those who have childcare responsibilities at a time when schools and other childcare facilities aren't open in the way that they were before. So I wonder if I could ask you something about how we balance that kind of need to support young people and those immediately who have lost their jobs with that longer term concern and a focus on older adults too. Can I ask Seema, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, thank you very much for that. I'll just make a couple of comments, and I just want to say I really I think Elizabeth made some really important points and very effectively as well on that, and I do agree with all that she said. I think in terms of inclusion as well, and around some of those challenges, I just want to say that there's a point that we often forget, which is that this isn't, the workplace isn't always just about the individual. There's so much that comes in terms of the socialization, the skills, the support, and the mentoring, and so it is really important that as we look to get, to support young people to get into the workplace, and we do and there's a lot of research around the scarring that happens, with youth unemployment, that it can also be difficult for those who do lose their jobs to get back into the labour market, and certainly and to be successful in it. And so I think it's important that we look at a kind of new intergenerational settlement as well, around jobs and skills, because an intergenerational view of the workplace does lend itself to understanding the role that happens with mentoring in the workplace, with different people that have been are able to bring sort of life experiences in as well. So I think as well, I want to make this point that what the crisis has done is accelerate digital and there's both a challenge and an opportunity in that. I think the challenge is that you could see workplaces start to redesign the workplace and jobs in a way that brings in technology more so than it did before. And I think we've got to be on our watch for what that means, because this is a trend that we've known about, but we don't want that to see the loss of jobs and quickly. But I think the second part of this is, and this comes back to some work I did around closing the disability employment gap a few years ago, that and having been also chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Assistive Technology, it's sort of been surprising to me that with the sort of advent of more technology, that we haven't really challenged ourselves more about how people who may have disabilities and be unable to be in an office sort of 9 to 5 can contribute to a workplace just as equally. And that I think this is, the experience we've had of lockdown has challenged our thinking in a way that I can hope can start to rethink how we think about the workplace and how we think about people being involved and productive in the workplace.
Thank you. Stephen, the top response that people have mentioned is boosting public investment to create job opportunities. So we need to do that in terms of the number of jobs, but we also need to ensure that the quality of those jobs is high. And I know at Learning and Work Institute, we've been working on what good work is, and we don't want to lose that agenda as we focus on more work. I wondered if you could say something about where you think we should focus if we want to create more job opportunities.
Thanks. Well, I'm really pleased to see that the sort of the top areas in the poll broadly match the 3 planks of the plan for jobs we were talking about before. I was tempted to ask the team to turn off the voting in case that becomes not true later on, but we believe in democracy, so we won't do that. But I think what's really important to me, and I think has come through the discussion, is that you need to do all of these things together, and if you just do one, it's not going to work on its own. And I guess sort of in answer to your question, I reflect on, it's been brilliant to see the in-depth debates and the sort of discussions going on the chat. And I think what comes through to me really starkly is a couple of themes. One is about making sure that every group gets the support they need. So I picked out young people just as an example, but we've had disabled people, we've had older people, we've had all kinds of different groups mentioned, and everyone's different, and even within those groups, of course, everybody's different as well. So that kind of tailoring and focus across the board, I think, is really important. And then the second point is that we've got loads of really good stuff already, and there's always a temptation to create new things, but we need to build on what we've got. and scale up what we've got. You know, I've heard about so many brilliant schemes at housing associations, through local authorities. I'm on the Greater Manchester Employment and Skills panel, which is trying to look at how you corral together all the support going on. And one of the things that's come through that is, how do we link what Seema was talking about the world we want to get to, with trying to create those jobs now, and doing it in a way that's a good quality job, but also we do it quickly and we get unemployed people and those who've lost their jobs or are out of work into them. So that's a really difficult balance, because that's a lot of very difficult things to do at the best of times, and these are not the best of times. But we need to do them all together and link up policy. That's always been our challenge, and is a challenge now. And then the last point I make is about the speed of action. So I'd love to see a back to work budget. I'd also like to see it now, because we've had that huge increase in unemployment that I talked about, and it does take time to scale up things and to roll new things out as well. So I do think the sort of need for action is really clear, and need for ambition and joining up. Just the last point, the proposals in our plan for jobs that we published a week or so ago, I think they tally up to something like £5 to £6 billion over 2 years, which sounds like a lot of money, and indeed is a lot of money, but compares to, I think, about £12 billion a month that the coronavirus job retention scheme is costing, and the cost of inaction for our economy and for our jobs and for livelihoods and for people's incomes as well. So I think ambitious action quickly that tries to link up these different policy themes, because in practice we kind of need to do them all, and having a real ambition for our future. But this is really difficult. Government can't do it on its own, and it needs to be a partnership with local government, with housing associations, with providers, and with lots of other people as well, in a real joined up collaborative way.
That's great, thank you. And Elizabeth, that second response, most popular response, is around investing in employment support to help people back to work. What do you think we've learnt from employment support delivered to date that will really help us, given Stephen's comment and the comments in the chat, that we need to act now, we need to think about existing provision and new provision as well?
I think, I don't think the sector shies away from payment by results at all. And I wouldn't like to give anybody that impression. But I think when you've got a challenge of, 8 or 9 claimants for every job, and the challenge of keeping people close to the world of work, anything that's commissioned has got to have a really good balance of a service fee for delivering quality advice and guidance, with a bolted on payment by results aspect. And I think that's one of the really important things that we've got to bear in mind as we look at commissioning.
Thank you. And Seema, there can be a tendency to create national initiatives when we're dealing with issues, but Stephen's slide very much talks about some of those local differences. What do you think we should do nationally, and what do you think we should do locally?
I think nationally we're going, the government does need to look at where the large schemes also need to be extended. So flexible furlough to help with the tail of how sectors start to be able to come back. Looking at the programs and the framework of programs that are in place now, but also what more might need to come in. So whether those to focus on employment support, and not expecting that the existing programs are going to be able to respond to all the needs and the flexible needs that are important. And the work and health programme is an example of working with those who are the furthest away from the labour market at the moment. What we don't want to see is that those that are coming into the labour market then are pushing people back who have started to come forward and develop the sort of both the skills and start to access the opportunities that have been created. And I know that there is, certainly in some of the providers that I've talked to, been challenges in terms of those opportunities being available. So I do think the government has to have a real focus on how it's going to support job opportunities. I think there has to be a debate about whether there'll be subsidies for those, and how the job retention scheme moves into a strategy for job retention, and in different ways, as well as the job creation. And those can't be done necessarily locally, but you may have examples of where, you know, in local industry working with local partnerships are wondering where, you know, where are the green, you know, what are the green jobs and what should we be investing in, and where can those incentives come from? So I think the government's got to, you know, set some of the direction around this and go a little bit further on where that growth needs to come from, so that there's direction and clearer direction for local partnerships. But the solution cannot be one size fits all, because one thing that local authorities and local partnerships and charities involved in when working with those who are out of work as well, they'll understand local need. And I think we need to have a framework that's going to be responsive and led with and by local communities, and with the support that can go in place with that. So that's why I think local enterprise partnerships and others are going to be a very important part of how we have a framework for helping people get back into work.
Thank you. And can I ask all of the panel what they think their role is for employers in all of this? We've talked about a whole range of stakeholders and how important it is to work together at a national or local level. How do we ensure that anything we do isn't just being done to employers, but really involves them? How can they be involved, and how do we make that happen?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
I would say, and this is really from my background in the provider community, but when you're filling vacancies, the really important thing to know about is what employers are looking for now and in the future. And some of the best jobs and the best progressions in work are where employers were listening to, were matched with the best candidate. Those people progress, they come back to you with backfill. And those relationships exist. And Joe Ingold and Tony Carr are on the call. We've been doing a piece of work with ERSA around about what employers want from employment support. When that is released, I will try and get that out into this world so everybody gets to see it. But it's about employers' needs and not making assumptions.
Thank you.
Can I come in on that as
yes,
quickly? I think it's going to be very interesting to when I think when there are increased discussions about where the jobs will need to be, because I think we may find there across the public sector, private sector, and voluntary sector, and that's going to be important, because you know there has sometimes been an assumption that will only be the public sector that's going to require a lot more support. But you know, if the private sector is to see growth, particularly in areas where we want to see the economy rebalanced and be investment that's led by you know, by the government and some of the opportunities that it does to bring the power and the resources of the state to bear through an industrial strategy, then it's going to guide where those, you know, where that growth is going to be for employers to make, or businesses to make those investment decisions, whether it's in technology or other products and services. So I think the public, private and voluntary sector are all going to be part of the solution here, because we've also seen, you know, the charity sector having been scaled back, but in terms of how the community responds and community resilience, COVID has also shown us the important role that being close to the ground is going to make. And I just want to make one final point as well, because you know I've seen some very interesting kind of innovative partnership working going on between local authorities, JCP, skills providers and employers, trying to get those solutions together. A, where the job's going to be, and B, what's the skills and what are the courses that need to be set. And at the moment they're sort of hitting a slight stumbling block because they don't feel they're getting the direction from government or a real kind of sense of national direction for HE, FE and other skills providers to be part of what should be a national mission.
Thank you. Thank you. Stephen, a final word?
Yeah, so I agree with what's been said thus far. I think the thing I'd add is that we need to make it really easy for employers and businesses to engage and to get what they need and to be focused on what they need, and to focus on how we help them to succeed and thrive as well in what's a really tough economic scenario. And I think if we do that, we'll find that they are really engaged and we can get some good results out from it, and that we can make this part of a something for something deal, really, which is that we will support you as a country and as providers and as groups to succeed as a business. And in return, we ask for you to engage with us to make sure that opportunity is fairly shared, but in a way that will benefit your business. So I think it feels like we can do that, and we've set out some thoughts about incentives for employers and good quality support for employers and all the rest of it. But it kind of needs that national framework and national leadership combined with local leadership and collaborative engagement together, I think.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our panel, and for those involved in the chat. It's been a really dynamic conversation going on the side of the screen, and some really useful points made as well as questions raised. So we are going to wrap up there, but I just want to let you know that we will be sending out copies of the slides and also links to relevant reports that we've been working on at Learning and Work around this issue, and our labour market analysis. And we publish analysis of labour market statistics every month, so please do look at that. Some of you might be planning to attend our Employment and Skills Convention, which is due to take place on the 9th of July. We are still going ahead with that event. It will now be in the morning of the 9th as a free online event, and I do hope that you will be able to join us. So thank you for attending, thank you for your contribution, and if you could complete